Hi, everybody. It's late Tuesday, and I wanted to try to get this recorded so I could upload it. So, I'm going to try to do this from home. My internet service isn't great, but hopefully, this will be okay. So we're on Second Kings, lesson 11, 12th book of the Bible, and in chapter 1, Ahaziah is king of Israel. He fell and is ill. And he sent a messenger to inquire of Beelzebub, which it translates to the Lord of the Flies, and that's a Baal god, to find out whether he will get better or not. And an angel appears and in to Elijah, and he's the prophet of Israel at this time, and tells him to meet the messenger of the king and tell him that since Ahaziah consulted Baal instead of God, he will not get better, and he will surely die. And I'm trying to track how many miracles or signs and wonders Elijah performed, because I want to make a comparison between Elijah and Elisha in this matter, and I'll tell you why later. So this is what I've recorded as the 11th one for Elijah. We started in First Kings with some of these. So Elijah tells the messenger that Ahaziah will die, and he does. The 12th one is Elijah calls fire from heaven and kills 50 of the king's men. The king sends 50 more, and he calls for fire and kills those 50. And the king sends another 50, and I believe Elijah kills those two as well. So Ahaziah does die. That's in verse 17. And Jehoram, who is Jehoshaphat's son, becomes because Ahaziah had no sons, takes his place. So chapter 2, Elijah is nearly ready to be taken away. He knows that his time is soon going to come. And so miracle or sign number 15 is Elijah rolls up his cloak and strikes the Jordan River, and Elijah and Elisha cross on dry ground. 16, Elijah is taken up by a whirlwind into heaven. So I have 16 things that I've recorded that were signs and wonders of Elijah. I found a table comparing Elijah and Elisha's miracles, and I've put that on the Facebook page. But the purpose is that when Elijah said his time was coming to an end, he asked Elisha what he would like, and Elisha said he wanted a double portion of what Elijah had. And so I had a evangelist preach that Elisha did have 2 times as many of these miracles or signs and wonders than Elijah did. So I was trying to track those for that purpose. And what I found in the table was that I think Elijah had 11 they had recorded, and Elisha had 22, which made the double. So anyway, carrying on, in chapter 2, Elisha uses Elijah's cloak and touches the Jordan River, and it parted, and he crossed on dry ground. Same thing that Elijah had done in the first part of chapter 2. The water in Jericho is bad, and Elisha asks for a bowl with salt in it, and he throws the salt in the spring and makes the water good. That's his second sign and wonder. His third one is that he curses small boys who were taunting him, and 2 bears come out of the woods and tear up 42 of the boys. That seems a little harsh, a little petty on the part of Elisha, but I recorded it, that was a sign and wonder for him. That's his third one. Chapter 3, Jehoram reigned 12 years. He was evil, and he was evil, but did put away the pillar of Baal. So he tried to do a little bit about the idol worship, but he was still evil. The king of Moab was to provide 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams That's a huge, imagine that. These kings from these other countries were having what they called tributes and basically blackmailing or holding these Israel kings kind of hostage if they didn't pay up. And so imagine having to provide that, I guess, every year. That's an amazing amount of livestock. So finally, Moab, the king of Moab, was to provide that, I guess, to Ahaziah. And he decided he's not going to do that after Ahaziah dies. So I had that backwards, sorry. Jehoram asks Jehoshaphat, he goes to him and says, will you help me to attack Moab? And Jehoshaphat agrees, and they march around the city 7 days. And then Jehoshaphat, wisely, wants to inquire of a prophet of God. So finally, after 7 days, he thinks about that. They inquire of Elisha, and he rebukes them for inquiring of God when they are idol worshippers. In other words, you don't want to have anything to do with God until you want to check about surviving a battle. And now you come to me. And he finally relents because Jehoshaphat asked instead of Jehoram. Jehoshaphat wasn't as bad a king as Jehoram. And so he prophesies that they will have victory. And this is fulfilled in verses 21 to 27. And the Moabite king sacrifices the son who would have succeeded him as a burnt offering. Again, craziness. But that's what these Baal and Asherah worships did. They believed in child sacrifice and burned up people. And also see Amos chapter 2, verse 1, that relates to this incident. So that's another sign and wonder of Elisha, that he prophesies that victory. The next sign and wonder for Elisha is that he meets this widow, and they're in this famine. They don't have money, and he tells her that to go get any pot that her neighbors can find, and they wondrously, miraculously fill up with oil. And she has so much oil that she sells it and pays for her debts and has enough left over to live on the rest of it. So she was abundantly blessed with this oil. So that's another sign and wonder of Elisha. The next one is that a woman with an old husband and no child had shown hospitality to Elisha. Whenever he came into their town, they would put him up and let him stay at their house. And they did not have a child. And he prophesies that she will hold a son in the next year, and she thinks that's ridiculous. But she does have the son. But years later, the boy dies after complaining of a headache, and she places him on the bed that Elisha always slept in when he would stay at their house. And she sends a messenger to Elisha, and he sends a messenger back with his staff, meaning his stick, with instructions to lay it on the son's face, but nothing happened. So Elisha comes and laid on the child, putting his mouth on the son's mouth, his eyes on the son's eyes, and his hands on the son's hands. And he did this 2 times, and the child opened his eyes. Then there was a famine in Gilgal, and Elisha gives instructions to put a large pot on to boil stew for the sons of the prophets. And one of them went out to gather herbs and picked a poisonous plant, and he puts that in this pot of stew, and it spoils the whole pot of stew. And Elisha tells him to bring some flour, and when it's thrown in the pot, it becomes edible. And the next sign and wonder, this is all in chapter 4, he feeds the sons of the prophets with 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain, and has some left. And that's similar to the miracles that Jesus performed when he fed the large crowds with fishes and loaves of bread. In chapter 5, we have another miracle, which Elisha heals an army commander of leprosy by telling him to go wash in the Jordan 7 times. And the commander is angry that a solution is so simple to this leprosy, and his servants convince him to do it. And because they said, well, if he had told you to do something elaborate, would you have done it? And, oh, yeah. And he said, well, then why wouldn't you go do this something simple? So he does go and do it, and he is healed. The next miracle is that Elisha's servant gets greedy, and this army commander wanted to give Elisha something for this miracle. And Elisha said, no, I don't want anything. But the servant turns back on the way home and goes back to the army commander and said, hey, Elisha thought of something that he would like to take for payment. And so he tells him, this army commander, what it is. And he takes these gifts. And Elisha finds out about it and curses that servant with leprosy. In chapter 6, we have more miracles. Elisha retrieves an axe head that fell into the water by throwing a stick into the water, and the iron axe head floats to the surface. I mean, iron wouldn't float. Elisha prays for the eyes of the servant to be open so he can see the army of God. Elisha prays for the attacking people to be struck blind. Elisha prays for the blind people to be able to see. There's a famine in Samaria. So much so that a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver. I'm not sure what they would do with the donkey's head. And a dove's dung was worth 5 shekels of silver. And again, what in the world would you do with dove dung? And in verse 31, it said, I don't know why the king of Israel blamed Elisha for this, but the king swears to have Elisha's head. Elisha does not appear to be worried. The servants come in and say, oh, they're coming. And he's like, yeah, okay, just lock the door. Elisha predicts famine relief within 24 hours. The Israel army officer scoffs at this, but Elisha responds by prophesying that that man would be dead within 24 hours. The famine relief does come the next day when they realize that this army that was coming after them had fled and left all the food in the camp. The people, because they've been in this famine, find out that this food is there, and they go as a mob to try to get, just think about us with looting and rioting. And that person who scoffed and that Elisha predicted would be dead within 24 hours, he's trampled by everybody rushing to get this food, fulfilling the prophecy that Elisha had given. In chapter 7, Elisha prophesies, a seah of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel. And the man who scoffed at the price of this flour is prophesied to not get any of it, and he's trampled at the gate the next day. So that's 2 more signs and wonders. Chapter 8, Elisha prophesies a 7-year famine. Also in that chapter, the king of Syria is ill and inquires of Elisha whether he will recover. And Elisha says he will die. Elisha prophesies the messenger will become king of Syria when he dies. The messenger kills the king the next day by putting a wet cloth over his face until he died. Nice guy. Jehoram reigned 8 years and was evil. And he was married to the daughter of Ahab. Remember, Ahab was married to Jezebel. The Lord was angry, but would not destroy Judah for the sake of David. And Edom revolts against the rule of Judah and set up their own king. Joram takes over the reign of Israel and is evil. Joram dies, and Jehoram only reigned 1 year. He was married to the granddaughter of Omri, which we read, seems like a long time ago. He was a former king of Israel. And this Jehoram was evil, and he combined with Joram to fight Syria. And Joram is wounded. And I know this gets real confusing with all these kings of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, Israel and Judah. And at one point they even have the same king name twice. So in chapter 8, look at verse 12. And they set fire to the fortresses. It's prophesied that they will set fire to the fortresses, kill young men with swords, dash the little ones to pieces, and rip open pregnant women. And if you look at Isaiah chapter 13, verses 15 and 16, it reads, whoever is found will be thrust through, and whoever is caught will fall by the sword. Their infants will be dashed in pieces before their eyes. Also in Hosea chapter 13, verse 16, They shall fall by the sword, their little ones shall be dashed in pieces, and their pregnant women ripped open. And Nahum chapter 3, verse 10, her infants were dashed in pieces at the head of every street. And Psalm 137, verse 9, blessed shall be who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. And Hosea chapter 10, verse 14, fortresses will be destroyed. So all these prophets are prophesying the same thing, that this is what's going to be ahead for Israel. In chapter 9, Elisha instructs one of the sons of the prophets to go to Jehu, which is the son of Jehoshaphat, and anoint him as king of Israel, and then flee. Jehu goes to Jezreel, the town, and kills Joram. Ahaziah had come to battle with Joram, and Jehu pursues him and kills him too. Eunuchs throw Jezebel out the window. The horses trampled her, and the dogs eat her except for her hands, feet, and skull, as Elijah had prophesied. Jehu, in chapter 10, sends letters to Ahab's 70 sons to pick the best and fittest and fight for your master's house. But they were afraid, and they surrendered to Jehu. Jehu tells the leaders of the city, if they're truly on his side, to take the heads of your master's sons and meet at Jezreel tomorrow. The people obey. They slaughter the 70 sons of Ahab. Then Jehu travels to Samaria and kills all the relatives of Ahaziah. He tricks the people into bringing all the Baal prophets and worshippers to him, and he kills all of them. He wiped out Baal from Israel, but Jehu still sinned by worshiping golden calves. So they got rid of the Baal worship and the Asherah poles, but they are still worshiping these golden calves. Jehu reigned 28 years, and his son Jehoahaz reigned as king over Israel. Chapter 11. One son, Joash, of Ahaziah, is saved by King Joram's daughter. When they came through and killed those 70 sons, they took one and snuck him away. They hide him for 6 years, and Jehoiada, the priest, puts a 24-hour guard in place over Joash and the palace, and he's made king over Judah. The people tear down the idol altars and images, and Joash is also called Jehoash. Jehoash, in chapter 12, reigned 40 years. He was a good king, and Jehoiada, the priest, guided him. And I feel that that's the reason why he was a good king, is that he was hidden away for 6 years. He had this priest kind of as his counsel, and he gave him wise counsel and to follow God's rules and statutes, and that's why he was a good king. And he reigned a long time. If you kind of look at the trend here, when they're a good king, they reign a long time. The evil kings don't last very long. So he tells the priests to have the temple repaired, but after 23 years, they still haven't done anything. And so King Jehoash finds out, and the priests don't get paid until the temple is repaired. So they had been taking in all these offerings and money and thing, and they weren't doing anything with it. They were keeping it for themselves. So Jehoash changed that and said, you don't get paid until this temple, God's house, is taken care of. So 2 servants rise up against the king, and he is killed, and his son Amaziah takes his place as king over Judah. King Jehoahaz, who was king of Israel, reigned 17 years, and he was evil. They continually fought with Hazael, the king of Syria, and his son Joash, otherwise known as Jehoash, takes his place. But don't confuse this king with the king Joash of Judah. So we have a Jehoash that ruled over Israel and a Jehoash or Joash that ruled over Judah, but they are 2 separate kings. This one reigned 16 years, and he was evil, and his son Jeroboam takes his place as king of Israel. Elisha becomes terminally ill, and Joash, king of Israel, visits him and weeps. And again, this king Joash, this king of Israel, was the good one, who was mentored and kind of raised up by a priest, and apparently thought a great deal of Elisha. Elisha prophesies that he will fight, that this king, Joash, will fight Syria and win 3 times. Elisha does die and is buried, and a man is being buried, and while the Moabites are on the attack, and so in haste they throw this dead guy in on Elisha's bones, or his body, in his grave, and he is revived. That is the 22nd miracle or sign that I have counted through this. And again, I believe that Elijah had recorded 11. So Elisha does get the double portion that he asked for. And this one that he performed after he died makes the 22nd, makes the double portion. And that's what the evangelist had said, but I wanted to double check that myself. So in chapter 14, Amaziah, the king of Judah, reigned 29 years. He was a good king, but he was not like David. The people still were idol worshippers. Amaziah asks Jehoash to meet him, and Jehoash refuses, and Amaziah goes anyway, and a battle ensues. He's captured and defeated. He breaks down the walls of Jerusalem and seized all of the gold and silver in the temple. Jehoash dies, and Jeroboam takes his place. Jeroboam reigned 41 years. He was evil. Zechariah, his son, takes his place as king of Israel. Amaziah lived 15 years, and his son Azariah was made king, and he restored Judah. In chapter 15, Azariah reigned 52 years. He is a good king, but the people still worship idols, and that tends to be a theme, that the king may be good, but the Israelites or the Jewish people are still fighting or worshiping idols, and they're not following God, so God remains angry with them. Anyway, this king was a leper, and he lived in a separate house because of the leprosy, and his son Jotham governed the people and the land, even though Azariah was officially the king. Zechariah, who was the king of Israel, was evil. He's killed, and Shallum takes his place. He reigned a month and is struck down by Menahem, and he tried to enter Tirzah, this Menahem, but the people would not let him in, so he ripped open all the women who were pregnant. That's the prophecy that Elisha gave in chapter 8, that the pregnant women will be ripped open. Well, this is it being fulfilled in chapter 15. Menahem reigned 10 years, and he was evil, and his son Pekahiah takes his place. He reigned 2 years. He was evil, and Pekah conspired against him and struck him down and made himself king. That never goes well. He reigned 22 years, and he was evil. Some of the people were taken captive to Assyria. Hoshea conspired against Pekah and struck him down and made himself king. Jotham is king of Judah, meanwhile, and reigned 16 years. He was a good king, but the people still worshipped idols. Ahaz reigns in his place after Jotham's death. We're now in chapter 16. Ahaz reigned 16 years. He was not a good king. He burned his son as an offering and worshipped idols. The king of Syria and the Pekah, the king of Israel, wage war on Jerusalem, and Ahaz wins. Ahaz takes the silver and gold and sends it to the king of Assyria. His son Hezekiah takes over for him as king of Judah and reigns 29 years. He was a good king and refused to serve the king of Assyria. So he's not going to pay whatever these tributes are. He doesn't care. He's not going to do it. Chapter 13 through chapter 17. Hoshea is king of Israel. The king of Assyria attacks. Hoshea had become his vassal and paid tribute, but then stopped paying. The king of Assyria takes him captive and attacks Israel for 3 years. He eventually takes the Israelites away to Assyria, so they've exiled. They're now becoming prisoners. The warnings God had been giving them for years have finally happened. Read verses 7 to 23. The king of Assyria this is in chapter 17. The king of Assyria takes people from other lands and places them in Israel. So he takes the Israelites out, but he brings in people from other nations to repopulate this area, and it's going to change the culture completely. These people from other nations did not fear God, and God sent lions to kill some of them. The king of Syria sends a prophet of God to Samaria to teach these people about God. That's pretty good. But they still worshipped idols. They feared God, but they still worshipped their gods. Chapter 18, read verses 13 to 16. Hezekiah is attacked by the king of Assyria. He has no allies, so he agrees to bargain with the Assyrian king and pay him. In chapter 19, King Hezekiah tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went into the house of the Lord. He sends for the prophet Isaiah. This is the first time we hear of the prophet Isaiah, who later has a whole book in the Bible. And he asks him to pray. And in verse 14, King Hezekiah prays. Isaiah also responds. God used the king of Assyria to punish Israel, but God will put a hook in this king of Assyria's nose and a bit in his mouth and turn him back to where he came from. So he's trying to give King Hezekiah some comfort to let him know that he's with him, but that these people, the Israelites, have to go through this because of their disobedience for all the years before. So read verses 29 to 31, which reads, God will provide for the remnant with crops that spring up for the next 2 years, and in the third year, they can plant normally. So he's giving him some hope that things look pretty bleak now, but in 3 years' time, 2 years, they'll start being able to at least gather some things that are going to crop up, no pun intended, voluntarily. And then in the third year, they can go back to planting and harvesting as they did before. God promises to defend the city, and an angel of the Lord struck down 185,000 Assyrian men, and the king goes home and is later struck down while he is worshiping his God. In chapter 20, Hezekiah becomes sick to the point of death. Isaiah came to him and told him to set his house in order, for he would die. Hezekiah prayed and wept, and God sent Isaiah back with an additional message that he would be healed and 15 years would be added to his life. Hezekiah asks for a sign, and God moved the shadow of time back 10 steps. They took the shadow on the steps, and it moved backwards, back up the steps, 10 steps. The king of Babylon heard Hezekiah was sick, and he made a visit. Hezekiah foolishly shows him all of the treasures in the house and the palace and the armory, and Isaiah told him that all of his treasure will be carried to Babylon along with some of his sons. And so, that was stupid for him to basically let the enemy in to show him what all he has, and then the guy came back and took it all. Hezekiah later dies, and Manasseh, his son, takes his place. In chapter 21, Manasseh reigned 55 years over Judah. He was evil. He rebuilt all the idol-worshipping things his father had destroyed. He burned his son as an offering and used fortune-telling and omens and mediums. God is angry and promises to bring destruction to Jerusalem and Judah. Manasseh dies, and his son Amon takes his place as king of Judah. Amon reigned 2 years. He was evil. The servants conspired against him and put him to death. The people struck down the assassin and made Josiah, Manasseh's son, king. In chapter 22, Josiah was only 8 years old when he began to reign. Think about that. He reigned 31 years, so he was only 39 when he was done. He was a good king. He ordered workmen to repair the temple. Remember, we had a king previously that ordered that done. The high priest found the book of the law and began to read it to King Josiah. And when King Josiah heard all these laws, which would be all the Moses law, all the, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, what we know today is that, he tore his clothes, and he tells the priest to go pray for him and the people and all of Judah. And they visit a prophetess, and she prophesies disaster. But because Josiah was penitent and humbled himself, he will be taken to his grave in peace and will not see the coming disaster. Chapter 23, Josiah has the book of the covenant to the elders. He has the book of the covenant read to the elders, priests, and prophets, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. He gathers them all together, and the people agree to the covenant. It's kind of renewal of the covenant that God had made with Israelites way back. Josiah purges the temple of all the idols and the Baal worship vessels. He disposed the idol worshiping priests. He destroyed the idol worshiping places, which is what most of the previous kings did not do. They didn't go take down those worshiping places. This fulfilled the prophecy that was given in 1 Kings 13, verses 1 and 30. King Josiah commanded Passover to be kept. It hadn't been kept since the days of the judges. Again, generation after generation had not kept this Passover, which God had told them to keep when they were still over in Egypt. King Josiah was killed by the king of Egypt. Jehoahaz, the son of Josiah, took King Josiah's place. He reigned 3 months. He was evil. The king of Egypt put him in bonds and ordered a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. The king of Egypt made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. He reigned 11 years and was evil. Nebuchadnezzar, in chapter 24, becomes the king of Babylon, and Jehoiakim was his servant 3 years, and then finally said, I've had enough. He rebels. Judah is attacked by the Chaldeans, Assyrians, the Moabites, and Ammonites, all the bad guys. Jehoiakim dies, and Jehoiachin, ending in an N, and the other one ended in an M, takes his place. He reigned 3 months. He was evil. Nebuchadnezzar attacks Jerusalem. King Jehoiakim surrenders and was taken prisoner. All the treasures of the temple and the palace are carried off or destroyed. He takes 100,000 men captive, and all of the craftsmen and smithsmen. Only the poor people were left in Jerusalem. He made Mattaniah, who is Jehoiakim's uncle, king, and changes his name to Zedekiah. Zedekiah reigned 11 years and was evil. In chapter 25, the famine is so severe. Remember that Elisha had predicted this famine, and there's no food. King Zedekiah tries to escape. He's captured, and his sons are slaughtered in front of him. He's bound with chains and taken to Babylon. The temple and the palace are burned. The walls of Jerusalem are broken down. So we need to remember this is going to become important later when we get to the prophet Nehemiah. Again, way back, God told them that they would be taken to other countries. They would be so despised that people didn't even want them to be servants for them. They would be so awful. And that this temple was going to be destroyed, and it is. Everyone is carried into exile to Babylon except the poorest. Even the pillars of the temple are removed. I mean, that's ridiculous. They even took the temple pillars with them. The chief priest and the second priest are killed, and instead of a king, a governor is appointed. Years later, evil Merodach, that's his name, evil-Merodach, king of Babylon, graciously freed Jehoiakim, and he was kind to him after he'd been a prisoner there. So to sum up all of that from the 1st and 2nd Kings, there were 19 kings of the northern kingdom, and none were good. And of the 20 kings of the southern kingdom, 8 were good. Judah survived 136 years longer than Israel because of these good kings that they had. So I found that fascinating to sum all that up after all of that. So that is 2nd Kings, and we will do 1st Chronicles, maybe even 2nd Chronicles next week. So happy Thanksgiving, and thanks.